In Orson Scott Card's character and viewpoint, third person limited narration is described as a narrator who doesn't fly freely over the landscape. Instead, the limited narrator is led through the story by one character, seeing only what that character sees, aware of what that character, the viewpoint character, thinks and wants and remembers, but unable to do more than guess at any other character's inner life. I want to talk about Brian. Brian as a third person limited narrator, or Brian's perspective being the third person limited perspective. Now, Brian is married to Cara and they have a kid called Alex. Now, Cara's mum is Sandra and her dad is Derek. Now, our question today is how should Brian refer to Sandra from his viewpoint in a third person limited book? You've got different options for framing names in the third person. And in this scenario, what might the narration, and I'm not talking about first person here, I'm talking about third, but what might the narrative voice, which is being framed through Brian's perspective, what might that narrative voice call Sandra? Well, Sandra as Sandra, just Sandra itself, is obviously one of the options, but that kind of depends upon how Brian sees her, and how often he is referring to her. So you've got various options, and I'll go through them all a bit more in a minute. Perhaps the first time perhaps the first time Sandra is mentioned from Brian's POV, perhaps Sandra could be referred to as his mother-in-law, Sandra. Or perhaps Sandra is going to be referred to as Cara's mum. Or maybe it's his mother-in-law. Or perhaps even Alex's grandma. Or maybe just Sandra. What the narrative POV calls Sandra depends on a couple of different factors, more than a couple. It depends on whether we're looking at the dialogue or whether we're looking at narration. It might be the same in both, but it could be different. It could depend upon Brian's relationship with Sandra, how close he is to his mother-in-law, whether he thinks of her as Sandra, whether they've developed a bond and he sees her, as a person in her own right and not just in relation to how she's related to him or how she's related to his wife, Cara. Um, it might be whether Sandra is being spoken about in relation to another character. So it would make sense for Sandra to be called Cara's mum if the point is to talk about Cara's relationship with her mum or Sandra's relationship with her daughter. And it also depends upon how significant Sandra's character is. Now, if you actually had Sandra being referred to as his mother-in-law all the way through a 90,000 word novel, that would get quite wearing. And I think it would be better for Sandra to be Sandra rather than his mother-in-law if Sandra ends up being a significant character. It also depends upon how Sandra is referred to elsewhere in the book. If we already had met Sandra earlier in the book, perhaps introduced to us by a different POV character in a different chapter, and Sandra was introduced as Sandra, then it's going to jar with us to hear Sandra referred to as Cara's mum, even if it is in a Brian chapter. So, important factors to be aware of when you are narrating in the third person limited and you are trying to pick how to refer to a character. So, consistency matters to maintain coherence throughout the novel and to avoid reader confusion. As I mentioned, if we've already heard her called Sandra, it might be jarring to hear her referred to as Alex's grandma, unless that's in dialogue or is needed for some other reason. And getting the right name for that character is important for reader immersion. So if we're third person limited and we're seeing everything from Brian's perspective, then what he decides to call her is going to give us an indication of how he sees her. So that's important for the readers to feel like this is a believable and authentic portrayal of Brian, his emotions, feelings, and attitudes to Sandra, his mother-in-law, whatever he wants to call her. That's about it. And I just want to ask if you're enjoying my Cherry Edits perspective. There's more available for you if you want my take on things. If you've been to my website, great. If not, go and have a look because there's about 3-4 years worth of blog posts in there. There's details about webinars. You can sign up to my newsletter and get something off me every month or so. Have a look around. All right, thanks.